I've told bits and pieces of this, but never the whole story. So with the Mordekaiser VGU, here's something that I think has never been talked about publicly. There were multiple Mordekaiser like updates that were started internally that never went anywhere because no one could really figure out like what was Mordekaiser supposed to be. Who was Mordekaiser? So this is when Ghost Dragon was in the game, the like Juggernaut update Mordekaiser. When that was in, multiple times people had spun up projects to like try a Mordekaiser update, but we'd just kind of failed them, within a month or two, saying like, this really doesn't feel like Mordekaiser. This doesn't work. And we'd given up on them. So Xenogenic came along, and he was given this idea of like, okay, let's do a Mordekaiser VGU. And he says, okay, Xenogenic, I think more so than any other designer that I have ever worked with or even heard of, had this incredible ability to just call his shot and say, this is what we're going to do. And everyone understands that's even sees this thing. That's how this is going to work. Like, this is where we're going. Like, I'm going to call, like, we're going to do this. And that's where we're going. And with Nunu, that was, Nunu was going to roll a snowball around the map. He wasn't sure in the beginning how that was going to work, how that was going to affect the rest of the kit. But he said, Nunu is going to be the snowball rolling guy. That's his thing. That's what we're doing. With Mordekaiser, from the very beginning, Xenogenic comes in and he says, we're going to the Death Realm. Like, we're going to the Death Realm. That's Mordekaiser's thing. That's who Mordekaiser is now. And from the very first test, and the very first test had this really bizarre Death Realm version where it was like, you spawned a Rise portal around yourself and an enemy, and then anyone who was inside either of the Rise portals would go in the Death Realm, and you'd have like sometimes you would legitimately have a 5v5 in the Death Realm, and it was kind of like, okay, what's the point of the Death Realm in this version? But we knew from the very beginning of working on the Mordekaiser VGU, Mordekaiser is the Death Realm guy. That's his thing. And the question was not, are we doing Death Realm? The question was always, how are we getting to the Death Realm? Exactly what are the rules of the Death Realm? So Xenogenic spent a lot of time working through, like, what about this version that's like Kate Ultimate? What about this version that's like Poppy Ultimate? What about this version that you point and click someone, and then each person that gets Mordekaiser ulted leaves a Thresh Lantern behind that an ally can click to go into the Death Realm, and there's a 2v2 in there, right? We tried all these different versions, but from the very beginning, we knew what Mordekaiser was. Who he was he was the Death Realm guy. And the really compelling part of this to me was, as someone working on the project, it was so easy for me to know like what was good and what was not, because from the very beginning, it was all about Mordekaiser is Death Realm man. Okay, so things that work with the Death Realm and are good in the Death Realm are good for this champion, and things that don't work very well with the Death Realm are bad for this champion. And so when we added like the Q isolation mechanic, for example, that made a lot of sense, right? Because like, oh, well, in the Death Realm, at that point we figured out you point and click someone, and the Death Realm is always 1v1. And so it was like, okay, the Q having isolation damage makes a lot of sense because you're always alone in the Death Realm. So that's like, that mechanic makes a lot of sense. And then the E always made sense. It's like, okay, this is actually fair both in and outside the Death Realm. And so it's like Mordekaiser's way of saying, I'm going to bring you closer to me, but it's not guaranteed to hit in or outside of the Death Realm, right? And it's like all this stuff just made a lot of sense. Like Mordekaiser getting speed in his passive and stuff like that. And so he's incentivized to actually fight a little bit before he starts the Death Realm. All this stuff made a lot of sense. It was a really fun project to work on from my perspective because we had such a clear vision of what we were doing and where we were going. Even when Xenogenic then handed the project off to Endless Pillows, who finished up some of the spells and like locks down the kit and like added the stat stealing on the ultimate and stuff like that. But from the very beginning, the thing that was most cool about working on Mordekaiser, and honestly probably even being anywhere close to working adjacent to Mordekaiser, was just understanding from the very beginning what we're doing is we're going to the Death Realm, right? And that was one of the things that I think made the VGU that we actually shipped very different from the other projects before that had failed, was that we had this super, super clear vision of what Mordekaiser was going to do and who he was going to be. So that's my Mordekaiser VGU story. Because from that time period, I tend to, on stream, talk more about the Pantheon VGU. But the Mordekaiser VGU was also a really fun time. I will say also, as the lead analyst on both of those projects, immediately after doing that, I was like, okay, we should have a policy where we do not make someone the lead analyst of two champions that ship back to back. Because the Mordekaiser and Pantheon VGU actually shipped back to back. That was brutal. I was working a lot during that time period. I was late at the office a lot during that time, let's just say. There was a lot of work being done.
How do you decide which mechanics are unhealthy for the game, like Pyke double gold on R? Well, there's a lot of different ways to decide what's unhealthy, right? To some degree, it's a matter of taste. You can't be perfectly objective about things like that. Pyke double gold on R, specifically, it was about his mid lane. It was much stronger for mid lane than it was for support, and the reason we decided that, Pyke mid was problematic was one of the things that we consider unhealthy in League is we generally believe that laning phase is sacred, and such that if you are a champion who ignores minions in a lane and still is winning, that generally is problematic. Which is different from proxying, by the way. Some of you will be like, well, if laning phase is so sacred, what about Singed? But generally, it's like, one of the problems with Pyke mid is that he was a very, very powerful character while kind of just ignoring the minion wave, which ended up being, like, fairly problematic. And then on top of that, he was very difficult to balance for support when he was so much stronger in mid. So, as a result, we did some changes like the double gold to kind of, like, weaken his mid lane. And we needed to weaken his mid lane because it was very powerful compared to Pyke support, and didn't really engage in the laning minion game, which we generally don't tend to want to allow. We nerf a lot of supports out of lanes for similar reasons. Janna top, Soraka top, Sona mid. Whenever there's a character whose main strategy in a lane is to ignore the minion wave and still win, that tends to be pretty problematic.
By the way, is there maybe a way to split Shaco's AD and AP damage on E like Twitchy? On AD, it feels really strange not getting evaluative lethality for your main damaging spell and finisher, as well as you playing AD and being denied any magic resist / controls magic damage on a huge margin. Plus, it'll be easier to nerf AD, but not AP or vice versa. So, I am of the opinion that the damage split on Twitchy is not good. I do not think that we should make spells, unless this is what the Champions kit is about. It's very clear and understandable why this is. I do not think that we should make spells that scale different damage types with different stats, unless it's very clear why that's happening. The reason why I think that is that Twitch E, like if you ask a random person, like you show a person Twitch's kit and say like, what type of damage do you think the E does? They see it in a couple games. Maybe they've seen Twitch a couple times. Like, oh, it does physical damage. Oh, but actually when he's AP, now it suddenly does some physical damage still, but also magic damage. Is like I think it's a very, very confusing and really deeply unintuitive experience. And I don't think that the gameplay improvement there is worth it for that to be the case. So it's like, I just generally am not a fan of those mechanics. I think if we built a champion to do that, where like, oh, I'm the hybrid champion, and this spell deals physical damage based on my AP and magic damage based on my AD or whatever, and they like built something like that for that purpose, I think that could be cool. But having that effect on just random spells effectively that people have no intuitive understanding of working like that, I generally just am kind of dubious of that, like it being a good mechanic. I'm just not really a fan of it personally. So from my perspective, I think Shaco's E should probably be either physical or magic damage, and I think it makes more sense for it to be magic damage. The fact that it doesn't scale with lethality is like, I don't love that, but I'm not, I'm not saying it's like the worst thing ever, right? It is what it is. I think the bigger problem to me is that we're asking AD Shaco to like max out your E early. I think if E was like your second or third max as AD Shaco, I think this would be a lot more compelling of, yeah, it's magic damage, but it's at least not your first max spell. Like imagine if AD Shaco maxed Q first. I think that the fact that your E does magic damage is less, like it feels less bad, because at least it's not the spell that you're putting your first points into. I think that's the problem, ultimately, is like, it's the spell that you max first, partially because of the slow and the base damage, and your Q not getting base damage in the same way. But yeah, that's my perspective on it.